This summer, the football transfer window opened on the 14th of June and won't close until the 1st of September 2023. To date, we've already seen 158 players signed by Premier League clubs, for an approximate total of €1.3 billion or £1.1 billion. And we've seen 146 departures from Premier League clubs for approximately €0.6 billion or £500 million. An approximate net spend for just the Premier League of £0.6 billion to date. And there's a lot of business still to be done. It looks like once again the Premier League will be net importers of talent, with cash flowing out of the league into other countries in particular. But what are the financial considerations of the transfer window? What do clubs care about and how do they go about their business? That's the topic of our latest video. My name's Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. This channel, Football Finance Professionals, is dedicated to teaching you about finance through the medium of football. So if you want to learn about football finance specifically, or just want to learn about finance concepts through the medium of football, why not subscribe? Like the video, leave your comments below, share with your friends. All of the above supports the channel and we're very grateful. So let's get started. When it comes to the off-season, the players get a short rest, but the rest of the club continues to work. The back office staff, in particular those in the football departments and corporate services, will be working together to try to meet the objectives of the club when it comes to acquiring and selling talent in the transfer window. The objectives will be clear and driven by the footballing on-pitch requirements of the manager and the team that sits around the manager. Secondary to that will be the finances, but there's obviously an interaction between the two. In the Premier League, each club will have its own objectives. That could be just simply to avoid relegation. It could be to qualify for European competitions or even potentially compete to win the league. Each of those objectives will have a knock-on financial impact, as would any European or domestic cup competition. Obviously, the Champions League, being the most lucrative European competition, would allow clubs to increase their budget beyond those that compete in the Europa League or even the Conference League when it comes to UEFA competitions. Those that compete outside of any European competitions will just be looking to potentially stay in the league and maybe go on a good domestic cup run to generate additional income. Once a club has set out its objectives on the pitch, whether that's in domestic or even continental European competitions, that translates into a financial budget from an incoming perspective. And that allows the club to set out its stall from a cost-based perspective when it comes to the existing squad, any additions to that squad, and any subtractions that it wants to make when it comes to selling player registrations. And most business when it comes to player trading is done in the summer transfer window, primarily for non-financial reasons. Football teams would rather have a settled squad before the season starts. As we know, and we mentioned it earlier, the summer transfer window will run until the 1st of September and actually closes at 11 PM in the UK at that point in time. Given the Premier League season will start on the 11th of August, there's obviously an overlap where the transfer window is still open after the season starts. Some people think that's a good idea and some people disagree with that. But most clubs would rather front load their deals to make sure that they go into the season or even in pre-season with the squad that they want for the rest of that season, if not beyond. In the event that deals have not been done in summer, there's always the winter transfer window to try to compensate for any deals that haven't been done. But that's not ideal, because disrupting a squad mid-season has various complications. One player in particular is going to be interesting to watch, and that's Kylian Mbappe. There's lots of rumours at the moment around where he's going to end up. And if he doesn't move in summer, or if he hasn't already when this video comes out, he could potentially move in winter. But click the link above for our thoughts on Kylian Mbappe's financial considerations when it comes to his next move. Financial restraints and considerations will come into play when it comes to player trading. And remember, player trading is a term that's used for the sale and purchase of player registrations, the intangible assets that sit on the balance sheet of each football club. Intrinsically linked to that is the player's employment contract, and one moves with the other. And through consultation with the finance team, the football off-pitch team will understand the financial restraints that they're working with. And it'll be often up to the accountants to be able to make the numbers work after the desires of the football team. As we've already mentioned, it's what happens on the pitch that's the primary objective of each football club. But what are the financial restraints that some clubs have to deal with when it comes to player transfers? Obviously, they're going to vary from club to club, but there will be some common issues. And the first one is cash. It's a common misconception that football clubs have bottomless pits of cash, even the rich ones. Most will have high outgoings when it comes to player wages, and player transfer fees for those that have been inbound or previously acquired. The cash profile of player acquisitions doesn't line up with the signing of the player. There's usually a significant portion of each transfer fee, normally approximately 2/3 of the fee, will be deferred beyond that first date of signing the player. The anniversary date, 12 months after or even 24 months after, is often used to settle that fee. So there's a continual drain on cash, both in wages, taxes payable on those wages, and transfer fees payable on previous acquisitions. If you've sold player registrations, there's often a delay in getting that cash, and it's up to each club to negotiate their own terms. From any club's perspective, it would be beneficial to shorten the selling terms where money's coming in and try to defer or lengthen those terms where money's going out. That's purely from a cash perspective. And that cash profile, which often has an element of deferred consideration, does impact our second topic, which is accounting. Profit and loss. Most people think that the cash profile has nothing to do with the accounting. And that's where you'd be wrong, because the deferred element of consideration has a time value of money consideration from an accounting perspective. This gets quite complex, but basically, you don't get financing for free. And by not paying up front, you have to account for an interest cost for the deferred element of that consideration. So on the selling side, if you have any element of deferred consideration, the profit on player sales would be reduced by an interest cost that you're effectively giving to the acquiring party. And the opposite is true from the acquiring club's perspective. If you have an element of deferred consideration, the cost of acquisition actually reduces slightly and you record an interest cost rather than amortizing what would be the intangible asset cost over the period of the contract. The interest cost is lined with that deferred element of consideration and is unwound until the consideration is settled in full. That's getting relatively complex, but overall, the accounting considerations will be still there for each club. The majority of football clubs are going to be privately owned, but some are listed and will be reliant on reporting to markets for earnings per share and share price considerations. In a privately owned environment, only the shareholders may care about the profit and loss results, but they will definitely care when it comes to potentially selling the club, because that's what's going to be reviewed in the event of a potential transaction. So as you can see, cash is linked to accounting, and accounting is linked to compliance, which is our third element of what we need to consider in the transfer window, depending on the league in which the club competes. It's imperative that that club complies with its environment when it comes to FFP. That could be in the Championship, League 1, League 2, the Premier League, or even European competitions. And each layer has a different set of complexities. But if the accounting isn't right and the FFP compliance isn't right, then it doesn't really matter which players you're going to acquire because you won't necessarily be able to compete in those competitions. That's obviously dependent on the budget that's being set and the levels of losses in each of the competitions. And it's not just about what you can afford to do today, because a player's contractual commitment goes beyond that season. And often, what we're committing to isn't recorded on the balance sheet. There's lots of contingent elements to a player's contract. These could be contingent payables to the previous club or even to the player, depending on individual performance or even team performance. And each contract is going to be different. There's going to be loyalty fees, signing on bonuses, and elements of complexity in the small print of the contracts that everyone needs to be aware of, often not recorded on the balance sheet at that date of acquisition. From a compliance perspective, if a club is reliant on 1, 2 or even 3 player sales to happen in a summer or even a winter transfer window in order to comply, then that puts a lot of pressure on the individuals responsible for negotiation. What if those sales don't happen? What if they're not at the level that they needed to be? What if the cash profile isn't in line with what we expected and the level of profit is reduced due to the accounting complexities of that cash profile? All of these elements need to be considered when it comes to the transfer window. So the more that you understand the financial aspects of a player negotiation and a player contract, the better for the club or even you as an individual negotiating that contract. Clubs will often review their budgets at the end of the transfer window, particularly at summer. Why? Because business doesn't always go as planned. Players will cost more than expected. Potentially players haven't been signed and you had to go for a second or third choice player. And on the sales side, the same could happen. Some players aren't sold, some are sold that weren't expected to be sold, and maybe for amounts that weren't necessarily what was budgeted for. But at the end of the transfer window, once it's closed, we can reset the budget and reset our expectations on the pitch. Potentially they don't move, but the squad will now be locked, and the management team know which players they have at least to the next transfer window, and hopefully beyond that. And the same will then happen in the finance team, is that the budgets can be reset based on the expectations of club management, and maybe there's some scenarios that are played out. That could be a worst case scenario of relegation, or being knocked out of European competitions earlier than expected, or potentially not winning the Champions League or even the Premier League for some clubs. What clubs definitely need to be aware of at this time is any existing commitments. Clubs can't just consider what's happening right now in isolation. There could be elements of existing contracts that are about to be triggered, particularly if it comes to, say, appearances. As soon as the season starts, there could be some players that have obligations that trigger immediately. And that will put a drain on the cash resources of the club. So committing to further cash outflows at a point in time, and it's usually obviously around the transfer window, then that's going to be a significant cash drain on the club. There may be some short-term financing that's required. Potentially that's a shareholder, or it could be a short-term lender, an overdraft facility, or a revolving credit facility. But making sure that the facilities are there will be critical, because what you don't want to do is not pay the players or miss payroll. But what terminology are you going to hear around the transfer window? Transfer budgets is one that you're going to hear quite a lot. And that will be an amount that a club is able to commit to over this summer transfer window. It's not going to be what's going to hit the profit and loss account if you're looking in the accounts of your club. It's not even going to be the cash profile. It's going to be what's committed before those contingencies. So the clubs don't necessarily need that amount of cash or even that amount of upside when it comes to FFP calculations, because the cost and the cash is going to be spread into the coming years. And although the two are linked, they're often not the same. Net spend is another one. That's taking into account the committed outgoings to the committed income. Income not being a profit and loss figure, but an amount of incoming commitments. Again, we're not talking about cash or cost or revenue, it's commitments, contractual commitments. As an example, if a player was acquired for £100 million before any add-ons, that would be described as an expenditure, but it is actually an outgoing commitment. To get to a net spend, if a player was sold for £50 million without add-ons or any other contingencies, then you could equate that to 50 million of incoming commitment. So you take one away from the other to get to a net spend of 50 million, being 100 million of outgoings less 50 million of incoming commitments. The 100 million from the player that you're about to acquire could be on a 5-year contract, meaning the actual expenditure from a P&L perspective is spread £20 million per year over that 5 years. The cash commitment for that 100 million could be over 3 years, being £33 million roughly each year. So you can see how they're all different. The outgoing commitment being 100 million, the amortization being 20 million per year that hits the profit and loss, and the cash commitment being 33 million pounds per year for the next 3 years. And from the sales perspective, you look at it exactly the same way. 50 million of incoming commitment may be spread over 3 years. That could be 20 million, 20 million, 10 million. 20 million up front, 20 million the year after, and 10 million in that second anniversary of the player registration signing. The profit or loss on the sale of that player registration will be calculated based on the net book value and any costs to sell, taking into account the deferred consideration once again as a cost to sell. And you could end up with just less than £50 million in the profit and loss account at that point in time. But that's not necessarily going to line up with any other element that we're talking about. So net spend is about commitments. Those 50 million or 100 million pound commitments could also change when it comes to add-ons, and they'd need to be accounted for at that point in time. That's another term that you're going to see throughout the transfer window. Add-ons or contingent fees. These are elements which will be payable based on events that will happen in the future, potentially payable to clubs or even players, and they'll increase the cost of acquisition from the acquiring club's perspective. They're accounted for off the balance sheet, which means they don't form part of the financial liabilities of the club, but they are often disclosed in the notes. So if you're interested, take a look at the back end of any of the financial statements of the clubs that you're interested in. And profit or loss on player sales, we've just mentioned it. This will be the proceeds committed to, less any cost of acquisition and net book value of that residual balance on the player registration side that sits on the balance sheet of the selling club. If you hear any other terms that you're unfamiliar with throughout the transfer window, why not drop us a comment below? We'd be happy to help explain them further. But for now, my name is Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. We hope you've learned something about the transfer window. Thanks for watching and make sure you subscribe and like the video.